Thank you so much, Hassan. I appreciate this and I appreciate the invitation very much. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today, speaking about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to share my slides with you here so that we can think together a little bit about this Islamic perspective on mental health. And before I begin, I just wanted to kind of give a recognition to the folks who've helped make this discussion possible. Certainly, the producers here, but also I want to also mention the folks at the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab who have been really working in the background to really figure out what is this connection between the faith of Islam and psychology. I'll share a little bit about my own journey in a moment, but you'll see that for the longest time, and maybe many of you, like myself, didn't really know that there was a connection or such a deep connection between the two. So let me start here by defining a couple of terms. First, when we talk about psychology, often it is broken down to its Greek roots and origins, where psyche meaning breath, spirit, or soul, and logia usually refers to the study of. So we're studying here in its original form, the breath, spirit, and soul is how the study of psychology begins. Now, if we add here Islamic to the word psychology, you get a very similar concept. In Arabic, the term is ilmun nafs, meaning or translated to the study of the soul. So in its original form of psychology, there is quite a bit of alignment. However, as you all know, as psychology moves forward and we enter into the modern psychology era, certainly 18th century, 19th century onwards. Now we're really talking about a different kind of psychology in which there's a lot less focus on the soul. In fact, if you look at the literature that talks about and maybe even critiques the evolution of psychology, you find a term, a phrase that says that, quote, psychology has lost its soul, meaning the focus is no longer on the soul or the spirit, but is focusing a whole lot more on empirical and rational aspects of the mind and the mind-body connection. Often it is termed as being secular and moving away from religion. In fact, most of the famous psychologists who are considered to be fathers of psychology, forefathers of psychology, are often quite critical of religion. And this puts Islamic psychology at a bit of a crosshairs, if you will, of trying to figure out, well, where does any faith-based psychology or any faith really, whether it be any of the other Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, or any of the other faiths, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., where does it fit in with psychology? And if we look at Islamic psychology, you'll see an overlap. The overlap is that there is empirical, rational, yes, both of those, same as modern psychology, sources that are being used, but in addition, also scriptural sources coming from the Quran, the holy book of Muslims, and the Sunnah, which are roughly translated as the mannerisms, the behaviors, and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. In addition, there is a study of both the physical and the metaphysical aspects of the human being. So very much keeping the soul and the spirit part of the discussion. And when you shift completely away from anything that is what I like to say, something you can touch or see under your fMRI machine, able to kind of point at it or touch it, right? At that point, it becomes, if we define that as being unscientific, well, then the soul and spirit discussion altogether kind of goes out the window. So you can see where has been tension, not in all traditions, but in definitely traditions that consider this study of the soul to be, quote, unscientific. And so let us kind of take a little bit further of a model discussion here, because in psychology today, the way I was taught, I trained at Stanford University, and this is where I'm a professor today, and in many other institutions that teach psychiatry and psychology, they train us on something called the biopsychosocial model as a core model of understanding the human being. The biological aspects, meaning things like genetics and epigenetics, things like neurotransmitters, understanding hormones. They train us on the psychological. What does it mean in terms of all of these different types of diagnoses that you might find in our diagnostic manuals, such as the DSM-5, which is the current edition psychologists and psychiatrists diagnose mental health conditions from. They also train us to look at the social aspects, environmental aspects that may affect someone's mental health. A person may not have genetic loading for depression, let's say, or trauma, but they may have experienced a traumatic event in their life that has caused them to become depressed. Or perhaps they're in a war-torn situation in which there is, in fact, social environmental causes of why they're traumatized or depressed. So we look at the biopsychosocial model to understand mental health conditions. Many would say, particularly those who come from faith traditions, that something is missing even in this model. And what would that be? It's the spiritual aspect, particularly those who are from faith communities and inclined to coping from faith within faith tradition that they come from. They often find, well, what about the ways that I cope that have to do with prayer or have to do with holding on to reliance on God? Arabic, we would say tawakkul, or kind of these other spiritual factors that they lean on or rely on or lean into when they're not doing so well mental health wise. And this often is really has become a perennial question for so many people who are from faith backgrounds. So at this point, after giving a little bit of introduction to this topic, I want to share with you a little bit of my own journey because I enter into the mental health space quite last minute, as in to say, I went into my medical training hoping to do something completely different than psychiatry. In fact, I often tell the story quickly that I had intended to do women's health. This was my interest, what I entered into the medical arena to do. And as we would say, if people of faith, God had a different plan for me. And what that plan was with all of my Islamic credentials that I had done prior to studying medicine, I found myself often in my Muslim communities that I was part of and in, that there were what I now can say mental health considerations that weren't really being dealt with or not dealt sufficiently with, or there was a lot of using just faith language to explain what was probably also psychological, psychiatric, medical in nature. And my journey led me to psychiatry, but almost with this quite a hesitation to enter the field. And I share that before I share the next few slides, because what happens next for me in my own training is I said to myself, well, I've trained on how to read and analyze historical manuscripts of the Islamic heritage. Let me look at what the early scholars of Islam had to say about mental health. Surely they've written something about this. I had never grown up hearing a connection between Islam and mental health. I'd heard about Islam and medicine and Islam and the sciences and the astronomy and the surgery and all the other forms of amazing contributions that the Muslim civilization had made towards the sciences and the humanities, but not necessarily mental health and psychiatry. So when I arrived to Stanford, one of my first efforts really was to comb through the library. They have a fantastic library. And I realized that in combing through that, there was a lot more there than I had assumed. And before I tell you about that journey, I want to ask you this question. I know I can't quite see you, but in your mind, if you're able to tell me an answer for yourselves, have you heard this statement before, that mental illness can only be cured spiritually, or that mental illness is its cause is a lack of faith, or that a person doesn't pray quite well enough, or they're not a good believer, or whatever the case might be. Different faith traditions use different language for this. And I certainly have heard this quite a bit growing up. And I would like to say that I am a product of my own community. So I had a lot of internalized stigma towards mental health as well. And as I mentioned, when I entered into the field to begin my training, I found that these kind of reinforced this kind of concept, really reinforced the stigma around mental health and caused barriers from actually accepting help when needed. And at the same time, that's what I was experiencing in my community. But at the same time, I was finding that in the literature that I was reading and combing through, a whole lot of discussion around mental health. In fact, I was discovering an entire healthcare system that treated and managed psychological conditions. I almost couldn't really believe my eyes, to be very honest with you. I contacted a number of mentors of mine, and mentors who became people who became new mentors who were writing in the field, the beginnings of these writings, and really sat back and discovered what I'm going to share with you now. First, that one of the main things I was seeing was that I had started looking at the books of medicine and said, let me look at the greats like Ibn Sina, Abyssinia, or Arazi. The canon of medicine or the comprehensive book of medicine are, known, well known in the field and had been used for centuries and centuries as reliable medical textbooks. They entered into European medical schools and were used there for centuries. And I thought, surely Ibn Sina and Razi had written something about psychology or psychiatry. And the books of old, in the medical books, they actually start from the head and go to the toe. And so it wasn't so far into the book that I would actually run across, oh, that looks like depression. Oh, that looks like anxiety. And I would kind of read these historical texts. And then I came to find, as they wrote in their references and kind of discussion, it pointed to other scholars and other works. And that's when it dawned on me, actually, the field of ilmun nafs, Islamic psychology, the study of the soul, as they called it, was not dominated just by folks in medicine, physicians. It was also written about, and others contributed from spirituality and ethics or philosophers. And so you find a very interdisciplinary field, and that stood different than modern psychology that we were being trained in. The works of al-Ghazali, Balkhi, Muhasibi, Ibn Hazm, the works of al-Kindi and Miskawayh, and the rest, and many, many, many more that are not even on the slide, all wrote about ilm al-nafs. And at that point, I was going through manuscripts and manuscripts. If you entered into my student office at the time, my trainee office at the time, you have found you couldn't really have walked into it. It was a small office, but it was stacks and stacks and stacks of manuscripts, starting from about roughly the 7th century onwards. And I was combing through these yellowing pages and old pages to try to really understand what was happening. I'd like to share with you a couple of the people I came across that really solidified things for me. Razi is somebody who we actually published a paper on just in the last year in the Harvard Review of Psychiatry, and really gave him back, I hope, his rightful place in the field of psychology, and explained that he was a famous physician and scholar in Baghdad in Iraq, what today is modern day Iraq. And he championed the humane treatment of the mentally ill. He himself was a physician and a director of a hospital. And he had this amazing case book where he wrote on all the cases of his patients of all different illnesses and diseases, including psychological and psychiatric ones. And he wrote about what helped them, what helped them get better, and also, when they would relapse and when would they do better, and what medications helped. It was quite detailed and scientific, using the scientific method. Arazi is also, as we mentioned in our paper about him, credited with when he was commissioned to direct a hospital in Baghdad, he took this very seriously and understood what we today would call holistic healing. That in order to heal the mind, you also have to heal the body and its soul. Mind, not just mind body medicine, but mind body soul medicine. And he took it upon himself to do a scientific experiment where he took raw pieces of meat and spread it around the city of Baghdad. And then day after day would go and look at the meat and detail what was happening. And he found that where the meat had less decay, this, over the course of days, this is where the hospital should be built. And where it decayed more, it meant that that's where air quality in that city was not good. And sure enough, the hospital was built in where the best air quality was in order to ensure that the patients would be able to heal fully. This concept really struck me and many other things he developed, but this one really was so eye-opening, of a concept in Arabic we call ihsan, roughly translated as excellence, but here it's the kind of excellence that you answer to a higher power. That's how you would better translate ihsan. And he writes about this in his book, in his notes. And he writes about the patient or client practitioner relationship. He writes about ethics of the doctor patient relationship. He talks about analyzing yourself, being aware. He talks about the concept of and I love this so much in our paper, we published on this concept of psychiatric aftercare, not just the care you give a patient in the hospital, but even after they are discharged, meaning that they are that when you discharge them, you know that after they've been in a psychiatric ward for a good deal of time, they people are going to ask them out in society, where were you and what were you doing? And also, it may have cut off their living wages for some time, having been hospitalized. So he would say not only is all of the treatment in his hospital free of charge, and I'll speak about that momentarily, but also even after they are discharged, he would give them, and he wrote in his book, 3 gold dinars. And that's a considerable amount of money at his time, 3 gold dinars. And he would say 2 of the dinars are for the patients who are leaving the psychiatric unit to be able to have roof over their head and not have to ask anybody for help, food, clothing, shelter. They have their basic necessities covered for a period of time until they can get back up on their feet. And that way they can, with dignity, reassimilate within their community. And the third of the gold dinars was meant for them to invest into a business so that they can then become self-sufficient. Phenomenal. Blown away, really, as we were reading and analyzing and writing about Al-Razi. And it dawned on me how advanced in thinking, even today's institutions here at the US, where I am in the United States, or where you are, the NHS, or just thinking about the various systems that we have are not quite this advanced in terms of understanding within care and aftercare of psychiatric illness. So let me tell you about his teacher, who I've spent quite a bit of time researching and writing about, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi from the 9th century. And, al-Balkhi was not known for a good deal of time. And one of my mentors, Dr. Malik Badri, Professor Malik Badri, God have mercy on his soul, has passed some years ago. He translated Balkhi's book. As you see here, half of the book is translated under the name Sustenance of the Soul. It's a tiny book, and I encourage you to take a look at it. And it is one of the most amazing texts. When I came across it, it was still in its Arabic form. It hadn't been translated yet. And I reached out to Dr. Badri and I said, he was a psychologist, Dr. Badri. I am a psychiatrist. And reading it as a psychiatrist, I was amazed about the breakdown of the book that Balkhi was writing. Because even in the title, the original Arabic, Masalih al-Abdani wal-Anfus, sustenance of the body and soul, the first half of the book is all on medical, physical illnesses, and the second half is all on psychiatric conditions. And it's broken up so beautifully into anxiety, depression, phobias, and obsessions. And when you look at this, it's really so interesting. And the chapter that really fascinated me and blew me away was the one on obsessions. We had just learned in my training, and there's, at the time I was training, one of the forefathers of modern OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, the person who developed one of the first 5 clinics in the United States on OCD, was there with us at Stanford, whose office was right down the hall from me. And we had just received a lecture from him in which he had said, OCD is a new condition, only discovered in the 19th century. And he named the European physician who is credited with its discovery. And this is something that is a new illness, and he carries on. And here I am in the same period of time reading Balkhi and reading what I think looks like OCD. And I contacted Professor Malik Badri, who's the translator of this book, and I said, this is what I think I'm seeing. I'm comparing it to the DSM-5. What do you think? And he said, what a fantastic discovery. You must publish this. And so I gathered enough courage to speak to the person who is out with us at Stanford and knocked on his door and said, I think I found something from the 9th century that says OCD is actually something that probably has been as old as mankind. And discovered and talked about, classified and diagnosed, and a treatment given so close to the modern day treatment a millennium before what is currently written in our history of psychology books and what you have taught us. And at first he sort of hand waved, just sort of waved me away and said, no, 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 this can't be, this can't be. Here's what the Greeks and the Romans, I have written all about there is to write on history. And so I kind of had to really gather some more courage and say to him, but can you read in Arabic? And he sort of stopped and said, no, can you? And I said, yes. And at that point he said, okay, go translate that section and come back and show me. And so I did. And it became a lovely friendship, mentorship situation thereafter, because it was him actually, this professor, who was so excited. He became so animated by what he saw. He insisted that I publish, and sure enough, we did actually publish this book about this article, about 10 years ago now, and I encourage you to take a look at it. There's a QR scan here if you'd like to scan. It takes you to all of the publications of my lab, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology lab at Stanford. And this particular paper that's on obsessional disorders in Balkhi's 9th century treatise is in the Journal of Affective Disorders. We have a similar article in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders that talks about Balkhi's discovery on phobia. Just last year, I published also on Balkhi in the Journal of Religion and Health on al-Balkhi's book being kind of one of the first self-help manuals we find actually in the field of psychology, because it's written for the layman. It's written for the layperson to be able to say, here is what you would do if you were afflicted by any of these different mental health conditions. Fascinating, truly. And it made me really think about this very interdisciplinary science of Islamic psychology. How you have people like Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who's often known in Muslim circles to be one of the greatest philosophers of Islam, one of the greatest jurists. People don't necessarily think of Ghazali and psychology, but actually, he has written quite a bit in his very famous Ihya Ulumuddin, Reviving of the Religious Sciences, and an entire book on the alchemy of happiness. And he talks about the spiritual aspect, the metaphysical aspect of the human being, how your heart, there is the pumping heart in your chest, but there's also a metaphysical spiritual heart, and how there is the brain, the mind, but there's also a metaphysical concept of cognition, and how there are emotions, and how there's also a connection, and these all, by the way, interconnect in his model, also a connection to the body and a connection to the nafs, which is the self in Islamic understanding. This concept, this interconnected understanding of the human psyche, also contributes to why Islamic psychology is quite interdisciplinary and quite different than the very biologically oriented study of psychology we find in modern psychology and psychiatry today. But there is a connection. And let me tell you a little bit about what happens next in my studies. So the next thing I come across, first I was really looking at individuals, the Razis and the Balkhis and the Ghazalis, but eventually realized, wait a second, these individuals are not working in silos. They're working within institutions of healings. And now comes the next stage of my work and development and research, and actually the book that we've just completed writing on the Bimaristans. Bimar in Urdu or Farsi in Persian, any of the Persian derivative languages, means illness. And Stan, just like any of the countries that end in the word Stan, is a location. So it's the place where someone who is ill goes, as in to say, the hospitals. The Arabic equivalent of this word is Daru Shifa, which literally translates into the center or the abode of healing. The Muslims refer to their hospitals as healing centers. And that really struck me too, that it wasn't just a place to, it's not just a place to go when you're ill physically, but also emotionally, mentally as well. And you start seeing actually the earliest of the Bimaristans show up probably closer to the 8th century. But from the 10th century onwards, you definitely see that each of these Bimaristans had also in them psychiatric wards and units, as I mentioned about the example of Razi's hospital. And that really struck me. And then it led me into this deep dive of figuring out, well, if you go and just Google or look at Wikipedia and figure out where were the first of the psychiatric hospitals, you almost always get something that's in the 18th or 19th century and almost always in Europe, and really no mention at all, unless somebody has really studied their history and is being honest about that historical study, anything about the Islamic civilization. Yet here were Bimaristans, which were in every major metropolitan city across the Muslim world, from the tip of Western Africa through Spain and into Europe, all the way through the Middle East and onwards into Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Asia, and into Russia. It is important to understand that just like mosques spread everywhere, Islam spread for prayer purposes, and religious institutions of teaching, madrasas, for education also spread, just like them, the Bimaristans spread too. It was a trademark of the Islamic civilization. And to know that in each of these Bimaristans, just about, there were also dedicated psychiatric units, meant that this is likely the first, into our knowledge and to our research, the first real medicalized treatments of psychiatry within hospital systems were developed in the Muslim world. That is a major discovery and discussion that is often left out of anything related to the history of psychology and psychiatry. We hope to rewrite that narrative and correct it. These institutions were beautiful, such as Islamic architecture often is. The amount of ihsan or excellence put into figuring out the spiritual symbolism that comes from arches, from the geometric shape, even sound, understanding that if you're going to heal a human being fully, you're not just going to speak rationally to them as we might today in cognitive and behavioral therapy. You actually have to heal their soul, meaning the place of healing itself, the Bimaristan, has to be calming and beautiful, hence the gardens, the fountains, the sound of water, the use of music therapy. We actually just published our first paper from a series of papers we are planning on publishing on the medicinal use, the medicalized use of music therapy within the Bimaristans as used in the Islamic civilization to heal mental illness specifically. This is way before the history of music therapy as it's written about today. They would bring whole orchestras into the Bimaristans to play specific modes and tones. And you have, for those who are mentally ill, you have people like al-Farabi who's writing about this tone helps bring up a person who is depressed, so play this tone specifically. And for this person who's very anxious, play this other tone that calms them down, and so on and so forth. It's fascinating. And we haven't even touched the pharmacological aspects of what they were using, and also the therapy, such as al-Balkhi in his chapter on OCD. He outlines and discusses an entire outline on exposure therapy, step by step of how you do gradual exposure therapy for a person who's dealing with obsessions, OCD, or phobias in his next chapter. And that is exactly the gold standard treatment we use today as psychologists and psychiatrists. This all to me was incredible and bittersweet in that it was not taught to us in any of our trainings in psychology. It's still not found in the history classes on, your Psych 101 or history of psychology. We hope to change all of this as time goes on. But I'm very excited to share with you the concept of all five senses being healed: sound, smell, aromatherapy, what your eyes are able to see. So the gardens and the fountains and all the beautiful architecture that has spiritual meaning for Muslims and those who are also treated who are not Muslim and happen to be in living within Muslim societies. Talk therapy, and now we're talking about the mind rationally, for those who are able to comprehend and use this, and also understand the importance of clean environments. The description from visitors at the times historically that were visiting Muslim world and writing in their travel logs about their visits to the Bimaristans talk about the clean white linens and the food that was given, and it was so nourishing. The diet was carefully paid attention to, and not every person had the same meal. It was customized to the patients there. And most importantly, how all of this was sustained. And when people say, is this an Islamic institution or an institution that was in Muslim lands? It's both. But particularly the way it was sustained is directly tied to Islam, because it was sustained by, founded usually by people who were giving their charitable endowments, waqf. And they were endowed the entire land that this hospital would be built on, and the hospital and all of its needs, but also the ongoing charity that was happening, because they would have then the orchards or a bazaar, a marketplace, or maybe they would charge for the hammam, the Turkish bath, the bath that was there as well, the bathhouse, and use those funds to sustain ongoingly the hospital. And that's why these Maristans lasted for centuries and centuries and centuries. And it was always free of charge to the patients. And it did not mean that this was just for people who were of little means, but also anybody could use these institutions. So to me, this was quite exciting. And we spent some time actually writing about a book that is hopefully going to be coming out in this coming year, Bimaristans and Islamic Psychology, a historical model from a modern implementation. The dream, of course, is that we revive this concept of Bimaristans. And in really thinking about all the historical aspects that I just shared with you, I really have been thinking quite a bit about what does this mean for us today? And what does it mean in terms of the inspiration or the impetus that started these institutions that were way ahead of their time? And a lot of it comes from the Islamic teachings. You'll find in the writings of the physicians I was telling you about and the greats, and even those who are writing the endowments, who are donors giving to these institutions in their waqfiyya, which is the endowment documents, you find that they quote certain aspects of Islamic teachings. For example, this hadith that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace be upon him, said that Allah said, if Allah, God, wills good for someone, He afflicts him with trials. And this concept of trials and tests in the Islamic tradition is not always seen as being bad. It's also understanding that you can be deeply loved by God, yet deeply suffering at the same time. And this may be a little bit counterintuitive for some. This is, in fact, the Islamic teaching. And it's interesting because it offers what we in psychology would call cognitive reframing, to be able to understand that you can and still and are loved by God, even if you're going through difficulty, and that these trials and difficulties can be expiation of sin. And that's often used in the forms of what we would call the cognitive therapies. It's also interesting to see other narrations that are written in the books of the greats, like this other hadith or narration in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, there is no disease or illness that Allah, God, has sent down, except that He's also sent its treatment. I found this written in so many of the books of the greats. And essentially what they're saying is, if God said something in terms of an illness and it's here with us on earth, then surely there's going to be treatments, and they don't necessarily fall out of the sky. This is where human ingenuity comes into place. It comes into play. And it's important that we really kind of focus on how do you make that happen? Now, the interesting thing here is so many of the greats in the books I was reading, they felt compelled. They felt compelled to figure out what are these conditions that need to be treated, what are the treatments that can happen, the scientific method, such as Razi and others were using to figure out day by day what was working and what wasn't, and the building of these institutions and the donors who endowed these institutions writing in their endowment documents, I am doing this as an ongoing charity in my name or in my family's name, so that after I pass, that there is good deeds still counted for me afterwards. This is also an Islamic teaching, the concept of ongoing charity or sadaqah jariyah. And that I wish, and many of the rulers and people of means who endow these institutions would write, and we hope and pray that these institutions, the good that comes within them, is how God forgives us and allows us to enter paradise. The connection between the two are enmeshed. You can't really take them apart. And this is why it becomes one of the trademarks of the Islamic heritage and Islamic civilizations. And it's really beautiful because then you see that there are these perspectives on mental illness that allow it to be hosted within one hospital system and not discriminated against. You have your surgical ward, your obstetric ward, your internal illnesses, internal medicine ward, and your psychiatric wards all side by side in the same hospital. Understanding we're going to treat all of this because if God sent out an illness, surely he's also sent its cure, and mental illness is no exception to the rule. And that to me is powerful. It's been an eye-opening journey in these years of doing this research and writing and really hoping to revive some of this work. I'll share some of that in a moment. But before I go there, I just wanted to touch briefly on there are biological and psychological and environmental theories, as I mentioned, of psychology. And there are, for some people, spiritual and for some supernatural explanations. And it's important to take stock and understand where folks are coming from. And often I do that today in my practice and really just pause and try to meet the person where they're at in my psychoeducation that I'll be doing to help them understand. And often when they come from a Muslim background, I'll share with them, here is your heritage. It's a mind, body, soul heritage. It takes into account the spiritual, even the supernatural, potentially, but also the biological, psychological, and environmental. And we need to look at all of these and not jump straight to this is all a test from God and it's all just possession by something supernatural, right? And I often tell my patients, I'm not a jinn doctor, I'm a psychiatrist, but I'm going to listen in and hear what you have to say. And if you request to also have an imam or a sheikh read Quran for you, I have no issue with that. I also have these psychiatric medications. If I deem that what's happening to you is let's say, a psychotic condition, that I would also like you to take into consideration. And this is our heritage, as we have seen in all of the writings and books that we've been analyzing. That often helps, particularly if folks are somewhat spiritually inclined, to just hear that I'm willing to listen to their perspective, such as you see here on this list, a test or trial from God, a punishment, a reminder from God, a mercy from God, an opportunity for forgiveness, spiritual growth and purification. These are all very Islamic perspectives people often share whenever they're tested with something, even illnesses. And making room for that becomes very important, So as we look at where are we today? Where are we at today? How do we understand all of these historical findings in the modern day today? I'd like to share with you that the concept of Islamically integrated psychology has certainly emerged, certainly in the last decade, even the last 5 years, I would say it's really bloomed. And I personally have been part of an effort to write a book called Traditionally Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy, or the TIIP, TIP model of doing psychotherapy, for those who would like Islamic spirituality integrated into their therapeutic process. And the focus here is really not apostolizing or religious counseling. Rather, it's to be able to normalize that we are made up of mind, body, soul, and there are spiritual aspects to a person's healing or even harm. There is religion that heals and there is a religion that harms. And really being able to take all of that holistically into consideration is very important. And certainly this field has been around, as I mentioned, from the beginnings of Islam, but also has had a modern revival era that's happened certainly around the 80s. We could say it started the 90s. You could see it became much more prevalent. Professor Malik Badri moved to Malaysia and was there in the 90s as they were developing the modern revival of the field of Islamic psychology. You have people in Indonesia and people who are in other countries really spread throughout the world um, doing this work. And you find, the first professorship in Islamic psychology in Jakarta, for example, in 2005. And even in the UK, folks have asked, well, excuse me, what are institutions of Islamically integrated? Excuse me, I knew it was coming. I just didn't know when. The sneeze, forgive me. What are institutions in the UK of Islamically integrated psychotherapy in the UK? And some of those are here on the slide here. The Institute of Islamic Counseling and Wellbeing in London, Ihsan, which is found in Bradford, the Latif Project in Birmingham, Inayat Health and Wellbeing Center. And these are all ones you can look at in your own locale. And certainly throughout the world, there are multiple other groups, and I'd like to share with you the one I've been most involved in currently, which is Maristan. And as you see, the name Maristan is taken from the heritage of the Bimaristans. Maristan is the Latinized uh, name for Bimaristan, these hospital institutions, healing centers that were developed by the Muslims, in which they have the psychiatric wards. Our nonprofit organization is connected to my lab. And what it does is it takes the research and the work and the publications of the lab and translates them over to tangible concepts that can be used, trainings and workshops, healing circles and learning circles that are able to be used and benefit the local Muslim communities and global Muslim communities. And in addition, there's actually a clinic as well. And the clinic is the beginnings of our hope to revive the Maristans and one day actually build out a revival of a Maristan. The mental health system, as I see it today, is unfortunately somewhat broken and not so holistic in nature. And there is a movement to come back to understanding mind, body, soul. Not the only one, certainly, and there are other entities, particularly folks from other faiths as well. I'm part of a large consortium of individuals who are talking about RNS, meaning religion and spirituality in psychology or psychiatry. And there's this effort that's kind of like pushing within even our APAs, the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, to talk about religion and spirituality in the field today. My hope, as I will kind of close with this and hope that this has been a useful and interesting conversation for you, the hope here is that we're able to get to a point of rebuilding and reviving and bridging to the modern day everything we've learned and benefited from modern psychology and psychiatry, but make it more whole again. And with that, I hope this has been useful to you. These are some other resources to leave you with. The Muslim Mental Health Conference, which actually just hosted here at Stanford, happens every year around this time of the year. And to take a look at that, I personally teach a course at Islamic Psychology here at Stanford University and also teach a course at Cambridge with Cambridge Muslim College, CMC, in their Islamic Psychology diploma as well. And there are some other folks who have been doing courses and classes in Islamic psychology that I hope you'll find useful. Of course, my lab is a place to take a look at. And with that, I'll leave you with this contact information if you'd like to be in touch, and really hope that this has been useful and open up for some questions with all of you. Thank you so very much for your attention.